Sometimes in the church, we have weird ideas about what consecration actually means. I used to imagine that we'd all live on a farm and anybody would feel welcome to just barge into your house and take your shirt or eat your cereal or drive off in your car. In reality, a close examination of the Doctrine and Covenants shows that that's never how consecration worked. And the question of how consecration works in the church today is one that each individual has to fully ask and answer for themselves once they know the principles that are found in the Doctrine and Covenants. So a little historical background. You remember when Joseph Smith and the other saints were asked to gather to Kirtland, Ohio, the Lord gave them two reasons for the gathering. One is that they would receive an endowment from on high. And the second is that they would receive the Lord's law. Well, the law comes in a revelation given in February of 1831 that's now section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 42 explains the law of consecration. But even before Joseph Smith arrived in Kirtland, the saints in Kirtland were trying to live some form of consecration. Inspired by scriptural passages like in the book of Acts or in 4th Nephi, these disciples saw that anciently the followers of Jesus Christ had all things in common, and they tried to just figure it out on their own without a revelation from the Lord. It didn't work out too well. When the church historian John Whitmer arrived in Kirtland, he noted the disciples had all things in common and were going to destruction very fast as to temporal things. Therefore, they would take each other's clothes and other property and use it without leave, which brought on confusion. When Joseph Smith arrived, he was asked to help resolve some of these problems by receiving a revelation from God, explaining how the Lord wanted them to consecrate, and then section 42 is received. Now, section 42 contains a number of different laws about how to teach in the church. It reiterates some of the 10 Commandments. It explains how we heal. It also, at its heart, contains a set of verses that we'll call the law of consecration. Verses 30 to 42 are the law of consecration, but really the heart of the law of consecration is found in one verse, that's verse 30, which reads, "And behold, thou wilt remember the poor, and consecrate of thy properties for their support that which thou hast to impart unto them, with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken." So a couple things. The word consecrate means to make sacred or to make holy. It just means that you take ordinary things and give them to God, which makes them special, makes them holy. It also says that it would be imparted with a covenant. You'll promise to do this, and a deed, a legal requirement, which cannot be broken. Consecration was an agreement that you entered into with your ecclesiastical leader. So in section 41 of the Doctrine and Covenants, Bishop Edward Partridge, the first bishop in the church, was called. And this is how the law of consecration would have played out in the early Kirtland period. The first step would be that you go to the bishop and consecrate all that you have to the church for the poor. You'd sit down with your bishop and make an honest accounting of everything that you owned, all the possessions that you had, and then promise to give it to the church or to make it holy. At that point, you and the bishop would then talk and receive a stewardship sufficient for your needs. And this stewardship was your private property. A person couldn't just come into your house and steal your shirt, eat your cereal, or drive off in your car, because the stewardship belonged to you. It was your property to determine, as you saw fit, the best use of those resources. There's all kinds of deeds of stewardship from this time where someone like Levi Jackman or Joseph Knight would go in and meet with Bishop Partridge and write down a list of everything that they possessed and then in turn receive a stewardship. Some people walked out of the bishop's office with more than they had going into the bishop's office because they were so poor that they received goods from other members of the church. The members of the church in turn voluntarily shared together the goods that they had to create a consecrated community. And these stewardships, which they owned and were theirs privately, were used to try and make the world a little bit of a better place. Now, the next step in consecration would be that you'd meet with the bishop again. After you'd taken your stewardship out for a test drive, you could say, "I actually have more than I need," and you could give the surplus back to the bishop. From that surplus, you and the bishop could figure out how your wants could be supplied. So consecration wasn't just about supplying your needs for survival. It could also be about supplying the wants that you have, the things that might not be necessary just to live, but that are good things to have. After you received your wants, the next thing that would happen is you would give a further residue back to the bishop that would be put into the bishop's storehouse, a communal store that the entire community could draw from, a place where there were goods and tools and other accoutrements that the community could use to fulfill their needs. And what was left over from that would be used to finance the church and help establish Zion. Now, while this is how consecration is explained in section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants, we need to be clear that this isn't how consecration works. It's probably better if we label this how consecration worked in 1831. This was a different time with a different monetary system and a different plan of finance. In 1831, the economy was largely barter. There wasn't even paper money printed until the Civil War. And usually the way that you obtained goods was by trading with your neighbor. And this was a good way for consecration to work. The way that consecration was established in 1831 isn't exactly the way we do it today, but the principles of consecration have endured, and the church has never given up on living the law of consecration. Sometimes you'll hear a person get up and say, we used to live the law of consecration, but it was too hard, so the Lord gave us a lesser law, and someday we'll actually live it. Well, let me just point out that consecration, along with chastity, are one of the covenants that a person makes in the temple. What if someone stood up in your gospel doctrine class and said, we used to live the law of chastity, but it was too hard, so the Lord gave us a lesser law, and someday we'll actually live the law of chastity? Well, same thing with consecration. We haven't given up on consecration. In every era of the church, the principles found in section 42 and in other revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants were applied to meet the times and the conditions that the Latter-day Saints existed in. Look no further than the president of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley, who said directly, the law of sacrifice and the law of consecration were not done away with and are still in effect. So the question we have to ask ourselves isn't, do we still live the law of consecration? It's, what does consecration look like in our time? We might even be using a different name for it. For instance, President Henry B. Eyring explained, the Lord has invited his children to consecrate their time, their means, and themselves to join with him in serving others. His way of helping has at times been called living the law of consecration. In another period, his way was called the United Order. In our time, it is called the Church Welfare Program. He goes on to say, the names and the details of the operations are changed to fit the needs and conditions of people. But always the Lord's way to help those in temporal need requires people who out of love have consecrated themselves and what they have to God and to his work. Consecration looks different today, obviously, than it would have in Joseph Smith's time, but we still live the law of consecration. Sometimes we hear people say that the law of tithing replaced the law of consecration. Law of tithing comes along in 1838, several years later, and is a subset of the law of consecration, but not the same thing. Law of tithing is a law of sacrifice and a financial law. Consecration is much, much more than just your finances. It's everything about your life. You consecrate your time, you consecrate your gifts, you consecrate the resources that you've been given, and you do it all to try and help God build up his kingdom and make the world a better place. Joseph Smith explained consecration very simply. He said, for a man to consecrate his property is nothing more or less than to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the widow and the fatherless, the sick and the afflicted, and do all he can to administer to their relief in their afflictions, and for him and his house to serve the Lord. So take those principles and apply them in our time and ask yourself what that looks like. As consecration spread and expanded, we gave it different names and iterations. We built bishop storehouses around the world and different welfare operations that were designed to help people become self-sufficient and give them the gift of having their needs and wants supplied, hopefully through their own means and by their own methods. As consecration continued in the church, it evolved and changed, but the basic principles remain the same. For instance, J. Reuben Clark, who was one of the people that set up the welfare program in the 1930s during the Great Depression, also studied the Doctrine and Covenants intently. And he said, the basic principle of all the revelations on the United Order is that everything we have belongs to the Lord. Therefore, the Lord may call upon us for any and all the property which we have, because it belongs to him. This, I repeat, is the basic principle. It's just that you see the things that you've been blessed with as not your own, but as things that the Lord has given you to try and help your brothers and sisters around you. Now, some of us have visited a bishop's storehouse where a person's needs and wants can be supplied through the goods that are maintained there. But the bishop's storehouse is much bigger than just those buildings that we built around the world. President Thomas S. Monson explained, the Lord's storehouse includes the time, talent, skills, compassion, consecrated material, and financial means of faithful church members. These resources are available to the bishop in assisting those in need. Our bishops have the responsibility to learn how to properly use these resources. Now, in our time, if you want to live the law of consecration, ask yourself this. What are the gifts and talents that you have? What are the blessings that you've received? And how can you use them to help the people around you? Maybe it's that you teach a piano lesson, or maybe that's you give a speech because public speaking is your gift. Maybe it's that you drive a kid to a doctor's appointment because his parents don't have the means to get him there. Or that you look after your ministering family and drop off a plate of cookies or shovel their walk. All of this is consecration. Consecration has a lot more to do with than just your money. It has to do with your entire life. It's a holistic way of looking at the world and saying, I'm going to take everything that God has given to me and use it to make the world a better place.